Hi, this is Helen Sanderson with a short film on team agreements. So let's start with why. Why would we want to create team agreements? Well, one of the reasons, and this comes from Brené Brown's work, is getting really clear about what's okay and not okay in how we work together as a team, so we can build a container of trust and make it more likely that we can do our best work. It's also a way for a team to reflect on what it's like to live the values of the team and the organisation, and what behaviours we'll see and what we won't see if the team is living our values. And we also want for this to be personal, really, for teams to reflect on what's worked and not worked for them in the past, and what they need to have agreed with the team, again, for them to do their best work. So the two ways of doing this are, first of all, reflecting on the research around what it takes to build trust in teams, and to look at individual experience. So if we start with individual experience first. In wellbeing teams, the way that we've done this is to use this timeline in induction and invite people to write on this to create a visual of when they started work to where they are now, to explore their skills and their interests, and to critically reflect on it over all their work experience, what's worked for them and what hasn't worked for them. And the reason we do this is we want people to explore what's been great about their work experience so far, and then to reflect on what would we like to agree as a team that makes it more likely that their good experiences can get replicated or reflected in this new team. And similarly, what hasn't worked for them in the past? What do we need to agree together as a team that makes the things that haven't worked for them less likely to happen in this team? So in practice, this is Becky, and she was one of the first wellbeing workers. And here she is describing back to her new colleagues what's worked and what's not worked for her. And then we use that to start creating that team's team agreements. And I'll share those with you in a few minutes. So this is the research that Brené Brown has done. And she's used the acronym BRAVING to break down the 7 elements of trust. So these are, as you can see, really clear boundaries, and team agreements are one way of expressing those boundaries, making it clear what's okay and what's not okay. Reliability, so people do what they say they're going to do. Accountability, people own their mistakes, apologise and make amends. Fault, which is confidentiality, about not sharing information or experiences that aren't yours to share. Integrity, Brené's famous phrase about choosing courage over comfort. Non-judgment, people being able to ask what they need, and generosity. So one way to build team agreements is to share this research with the team and ask them to think about it from their perspective, and then work out what statements they'd want to have on their team agreements that reflect this. So it's not simply taking all of these and making them into team agreements, but inviting team members to reflect on them, or create the team agreements first of all, using the approach I've just described, and then reflecting back on these and checking that you've got everything that you want in the team agreements, and whether there are more of those based on the research that you want to include. So these are the actual team agreements from Becky's team, and I was there when they were creating it, and I specifically remember Becky suggesting a team agreement that is, if we don't know the answer, we find it. So these are examples of what team agreements can look like. And the other way to think about is how we display and use team agreements. So with Becky's team, those team agreements were up at every team meeting that they had to keep them at mind. With the team agreements for the national team, because we meet over Zoom, we've created a smaller version of our team agreements that fit in our bullet journals or our diaries, and we keep them there to keep reflecting on them. So with all team agreements, it's really, really important that you've got different ways of keeping them in front of you and in mind, so that we can keep reflecting on them. So having team agreements is one thing. How do we make sure that they're making a difference in the way that we work? And as I've said, one way to do that is making sure we've got ways to keep them present, keep them in mind, keep them visually in front of us. But the other way of doing it is how we review them. And there's 2 ways of doing this, both individually and collectively. One of the ways of doing this individually is through confirmation practices. And these were developed by Andy Brogren as a self-reflective process for you to think about how you're working, what you're doing, what you're pleased about around the way that you're working, and what you want to keep developing and improving on. And here's an example of confirmation practices that wellbeing workers do with their buddy. And as you'll see, there's a statement at the beginning, and one of ours is, for wellbeing workers, I'm confident that I always provide compassionate, person-centred and safe care. We help our colleagues understand why we want to pay attention to this. And one of the ways we've been doing this is linking back to our values. And the first two values of wellbeing teams are compassion and responsibility. Then we invite people to give themselves a score between 1 and 5. 5 is, I'm really doing this to the best of my ability. I'm really very confident that I'm providing this. And 1 is, I'm not very confident at all. And then we ask people to share why they gave themselves that score. So if you gave yourself a 3, what's the reason behind giving yourself a 3? What is it you think you could do more or better on? And then that leads to, when you've looked at and wellbeing workers have 6 confirmation practice statements. When you've looked at those statements, what's the 1 or 2 where you've given yourself the lowest score? And what do you intend to do about that over the next month? So we use confirmation practices every 2 weeks. We do it with our buddies. So it means that if I'm doing my confirmation practices with my buddy, say Emily, and this happened last week for me actually, I'd rated myself a 3. I was challenged on why I'd given myself a 3 by Emily. And when I explained, we agreed that actually that was a 4, not a 3. So sometimes your scores might increase by looking at it with your buddy, but equally sometimes you might think actually, that's a bit too high. I'm actually a 2 on that, not a 3. So your buddy has a role in challenging and supporting you around your confirmation practices and helping you craft or decide what you're going to do over the next month. Now, our confirmation practices here comes from our role, but you can also use this principle around your team agreements. So, for example, your first statement there might be your first team agreement, and then you'd be giving yourself a score of 1 to 5 and why you gave yourself a score. Another way of doing it, and doing it collectively, is in a sort of person-centred team review style. And this is how we've been doing person-centred team reviews in wellbeing teams. So we'd have your team agreements up and public, and then you'd have paper up on the walls that says what's working about how we're living our team agreements, what's not working about how we're living our team agreements, and what we think we could do in the future. So everybody gets up with a pen, writes on the working and not working board and what they'd like to see happening in the future. Then we sit down, reflect on those. We might do multi-dot voting to decide on what the most important ones are that aren't working, the most important that are working, and then use that to agree what we're going to be doing differently over the next month, 2 months or 3 months, so that we can keep developing how we're living our team agreements. It's also an opportunity to review our team agreements and see if there are ones that we want to change or add or rephrase how we're doing. So one of the things that we'd encourage you to do is develop confirmation practices around your team agreements, which is simply having the team agreements on a piece of paper, then scoring yourself for each one on a scale of 1 to 5, then explaining why you've given it that score and what you intend to do about it over the next month or 2 months, depending on the frequency, and perhaps every 3 months or 6 months, collectively looking at how you think you're living your team agreements. Now, you might have team agreements that are broadly around how you work together as a team, or you might be really specifically focusing on one area of your work as a team. For example, how you're communicating together, or how you're using email. So therefore, you might get to team agreements by looking at what's working and not working, about how the team's communicating or how they're using email, and then have team agreements that specifically focus on that, but then using the same review processes that I've just suggested, confirmation practices and a collective review of the agreements together, and either writing on what's working and not working, or of course you could do it in a team meeting and use stickies. So I hope you develop team agreements that you're really proud of and pleased with, that reflect what's working and not working for your team, that also might reflect the research on trust, and you have robust ways of reviewing them and keeping improving them. Thank you.